Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, it's a privilege to be able to share with you today some work that we've done over the past few years. And I know I was just chatting with my colleague Paul Villeneuve yesterday, so I know he'll be a tough act to follow. So I'll do my best to make it as entertaining as Paul can make it. I was asked by Cheryl Peters. Thank you, Cheryl. I don't know if you're around today or not, but to talk about some of the work we've done in trying to bring together a variety of different indicators about the quality of the environment into a single index that we may be able to use not only in health research, but also to help guide policy and decision makers about where we might find inequalities in environmental health in our Canadian urban centers. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Just as a bit of an overview here. Oh, there we go. So I'm going to start out with a bit of a caveat, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we understand urban built environments and health. And I think for many of you, you're probably quite familiar with this subject area. And I'm going to talk a little bit about obviously the focus is the Canadian Environmental Quality Index. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some forthcoming work and future research that we're hoping to do. The other thing I'd like to do as well is acknowledge where I'm coming from is in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is situated on the territory of the Mi'kmaq people in Mi'kmaq. I would also like to acknowledge the role and contributions of African Nova Scotians who have been living in the province for approximately 400 years as well. So in terms of caveats, what you're going to see today, it has been, the Environmental Quality Index, the development of it has been published. So if you're interested, I'm happy to, you can look up the paper. It's the only Can-EQI paper out there in Environmental International, but it is, I would say it's like our first attempt. It's our first go. It's the beta version or even alpha version of the Can-EQI. Lots of development can occur, lots of improvements. We'd love to get feedback and insights from experts like yourself in this area. And obviously trying to integrate a bunch of data together into a sort of single view of the way things look is complicated. And not only that, but the idea about, healthy cities or what makes healthy cities has been around for quite a long time, over 150 years. And if you get a chance, the English is a little odd, but if you get a chance to read Benjamin Richardson's Hygeia, the City of Health from 1876, it's an interesting read. And there's a little cartoon there that just shows that if you were to implement Hygeia in cities, the doctors would be out of a job because people would be so healthy that we wouldn't require as much healthcare at all. And of course, more recently, it's been recognized by the Chief Medical Officer, Chief Public Health Officer in Canada, Dr. Teresa Tam, as built environments is playing a major role, of course, in population health. So in terms of this project, it was funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada. So I'd like to thank Margaret DeGrow of FAC and also my colleague Zoe Davis, who's now working on her PhD down at the University of Melbourne. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about, as I mentioned, urban built environments and health. And I was asked to create some poll questions, so I'm going to shoot to those now. So here are the poll questions. And I believe somebody's going to take care of that for us. That's great. So that looks like the first poll has ended. And those who answered, 82% are correct. So that is the official statistics by Stats Canada. It's actually 81.59 at this point. So we just say 82%. But That's a marked difference from a century ago when it was completely the reverse. It was about 20% of Canadians lived in urban areas and about 80% of rural areas. So not sure, do I go to the next poll or, okay. So the next question is, what proportion of our time do we spend in the following environments? Okay, great. So the correct answer to that one is 90% of our time on average between winter and summer is spent indoors, and about 5% is outdoors. Obviously, that would vary by season, and about 5% of our time in vehicles of any kind. So congratulations to those of you who, the 20 of you, or no, the 10 of you who answered 95 and 5. So I guess I can close the poll now.
Yes.
On. Yeah, so hopefully some of you recognize some of these photos. I mean, Canadians are by and large urbanized, and so as a species, this is a relatively new position for us to be in. It wasn't that long ago that most of us lived in more rural environments, and so it's only because it's only been, at least in Canada and in other industrialized nations, only the last 100 to 150 years that there's been a transition. We can expect that obviously that's going to modify our health in different ways. And so it's important for us to try and figure out what are these sort of pathways through which living in urban environments influence our health. So the poll data I was referring to comes from the time use surveys conducted by the federal government, Stats Canada, and looking in winter and summer differences in where people spend their time. And you can see in the winter time, we spend a majority of over 90% of our time indoors and only about 3% of our time outdoors. And that changes considerably, almost 3 times as much time. We spend 3 times more of our time outside in the summertime, and in vehicle time remains about the same over the year. But we have to remember that we do spend almost all of our time in Earth's ecosystems, so that even though we're in these urban environments, we're actually situated in a broader context whereby we have biogeochemical cycling and climate change and a lot of other planetary changes going on. And we have to acknowledge the role that our activities and behaviors have on these larger ecosystems that can also influence our health in cities. So understanding how health affects human beings, or how our health is affected in urban environments, can be quite a challenge. And I don't really know how to create some kind of mapping of how all these ideas relate to each other, but when you see a picture, an overhead view of course I picked Vancouver so that everybody would be familiar with the location. But if you look at it from above and you just think for a moment, how did it get to be the way it is at the moment? How is it that the streets are designed in a certain way? Why are the buildings the way they are? Why are we using the materials the way they are? Why are they spaced in a certain way? Why are there some areas that have green around them and some areas that don't? But in some cities, do they build right up to the water like we do here? Or why do they leave this whole green space untouched? And then attach a bridge to it and then put it to somewhere else. And without going into a lot of detail, the seeds of many cities, at least in Canada, of course, are probably borrowed from colonial understandings of what urban design should look like, and of course, commerce and trade. But the urban areas that we experience, their shape and their feel of cities, are really the resultant of several related interacting processes, right? So all of these sort of a list of words I have here, things like zoning and land use policies, planning requirements, market valuations, private and public investments by various levels of government and interests, And all of these come together to produce what we see today as cities. And so it's, incumbent upon us to think about those are sort of the upstream drivers of the way cities are now. And what we typically look at are the more downstream effects of all of these drivers and how they influence health. Northridge in 2003, I think, wrote a really interesting, I'd almost say seminal paper in sort of conceptualizing the sort of processes or a framework through which built environments can create health inequalities. And as a sort of more social geographer epidemiologist, she was quite interested in situating it in the social determinants of health. But what there's a lot of pieces to it that I think are relevant here, and that's really thinking about how our cities and urban areas are really nested within natural environments. They have these sort of macro level forces acting upon them. And then we already have these sort of socioeconomic inequalities that exist through various policies and so on through multiple levels of government. And these can relate to the sort of look and feel and texture of the built environment. And then from that leads to the different behaviors we participate in, and can lead to, for example, changes in the quality of the environment through the creation of pollution. Maybe it's not pollution, but maybe it has to do with our sort of health behaviors related to physical activity or active transportation, or maybe it has more to do with sociality, how much we interact with each other and so on. And a lot of these, when you bring them together, they culminate in our understanding of sort of how healthy we are and what sort of levels of well-being we have. So that's a nice framework. If you haven't had a chance to look at that paper, I really recommend it. So, for example, just to illustrate how complicated things can be, we tend to want to promote more walkable areas, for example, and there are metrics now that you can sort of look to try and figure out whether an area is more or less walkable. But we also have to keep in mind that a lot of the time, the areas that tend to be more walkable also have higher concentrations of combustion-related air pollution and noise, for example. Or green spaces, we know that they can benefit health directly, supporting mental health and physical activities behavior, but they can also indirectly influence health by possibly attenuating some of those exposures to harmful air pollutants and noise, for example. So, I think in Canada, we've done a really great job. We have some amazing researchers from across the country at UBC, all the way, hopefully, to Halifax as well, in Newfoundland, who've looked at, in general, what I would call sort of single exposures of environmental characteristics and how they affect health. And with the advent of large cohorts, like the CLSA and Can-EQI and many others, there's been some fantastic epidemiological work linking air pollution, greenness, traffic noise, heat events, and many radon, for example, to health outcomes and even in some cases health behaviors. So, I'd say there's a lot of strong research in that area, and we probably have at least 40 to 50 years of studies of various designs that clearly show there's a link between exposure to different air pollutants at various levels. The recent MAPLE work shows very low levels of air pollution can have health impacts. What we don't really have that they do sort of tend to use on the social determinant side is composite measures of the environment. And they've been used on the social side, like, the index of deprivation that came out of the UK and then was created in Canada, replicated in Canada, and there are other types of indices. Now we have the marginalization index in Canada as well. So those indexes are quite useful. Those indices are quite useful for being able to understand inequalities and socioeconomic status and health and so on. But we haven't really had one related to the quality of the environment, particularly in our urban areas. So the question really comes down to, how do we represent several environmental exposures simultaneously, for example, in some kind of an index. So just an example, this is looking at the creation of a MEDIC score, which is based off of Richardson's work, and this is looking in Portugal, for example. So I think it was a PhD student, Ribeiro, who was working with Jamie Pierce and others at Creche in Scotland, and they developed, repeated the sort of the MEDICS score, which was developed by Richardson, as I mentioned originally, for Portugal, and then started to look at various health outcomes and health behaviors in relation to positioning along the continuum of the score. So they have different categories from -1 to 4, and you'll see here the index that I'm going to talk about today is a little bit different. But what you can see clearly is there's sort of linear relationship between cancer mortality and the rate ratio, and an increasing MEDIC score. So it means that the ratio is higher, and when the score is higher, it means that the environmental conditions in those areas aren't as good as they are with a lower score. So what it allows you to do is sort of visualize the role of environmental quality with health inequalities, and also take upon conduct an assessment of sort of the cumulative exposure from multiple sources simultaneously. I'd like to think that we were the first to sort of think about the development of a Canadian environmental quality index, and unfortunately that's just not true. In my work in writing up the paper and writing up the manuscript for this work, I actually came across a paper in Science written by a fellow, last name Inhaber, who's no longer with the federal service, but used to work for the federal government at one point, and wrote this article in 1974, which is all about the development of environmental quality index for Canada, which unfortunately was never acted upon. But it was one of these processes where they brought together 40 or 50 people with different backgrounds and came up with this idea that they need to look at air quality and water quality, land quality, and then they had a miscellaneous category for pesticides and radioactivity. So just quoting from the paper, the idea is if you can evaluate environmental factors properly, then we're well on our way to formulating an approach to evaluating the quality of life. And it was likened more to like a financial index, of course, with a different sort of temporal regime. Okay, so just another poll for you here. I got the idea for this off Paul, because I think he asked you a question about the Prime Minister. So I'm going to ask you, who is the Minister of the Environment under what Prime Minister of Canada when Inhaber was trying to get this index moving forward? Some of you will have to know history, and some of you may have been alive. I get a lot of time for this one. Okay, so those of you who answered Jack Davis and Pierre Trudeau were correct. There's a close tie, almost a tie. There was Jean Marchand and Pierre Trudeau, so good job. And of course, Stephen Guilbeault is current Minister of Environment and Climate Change, so definitely not the right one, but excellent. And then are we moving to the other question, or is it?
Would you like people to answer in the chat box for number 4?
Yeah, I think I was going to ask a question. I'll just take down this poll now. I'm asking the question: what aspects of the urban environment do you feel are modifiable? And which of these do you believe would have the greatest benefit to population health? So there are probably a variety of them that you may be interested in or thinking about, but it's more of a thought question. So it's if you'd like to share with others through the chat, that might be really nice. And in the meantime, I'm going to keep moving through the presentation if that's okay.
Sounds good.
Okay. Yeah, so now I'm going to move on to sort of the introduction, and I'm going to move on to, I guess, the new version of the Canadian Environmental Quality Index. And just to step back for one moment, I mean, one of the reasons why we're able to actually consider even developing something like an environmental quality index is also because of the work of, I have to, of course, refer to the development of Can-EQI, the consortium looking at environmental health research in Canadian cities under the leadership of Jeff Brook. And myself and many others have been a part of Can-EQI since its inception. And it's a wonderful idea for those of us, particularly doing environmental health work, environmental exposure, environmental epidemiology. A lot of us have had to collect our own data sets over time, and then the notion or the idea about bringing them all together under one roof and then sharing them with other researchers so that they can explore their own research questions, to me, it's been fabulous. So I'm hoping at some point too that the Canadian Environmental Quality Index will be made available as well through Can-EQI at some point. So we had a number of different objectives, and I'm just going to focus on a few of them in more detail. But obviously, as a first step, we needed to identify and verify data sets that characterize the quality of Canada's urban environments. And then the second step was we needed to identify and define what urban neighborhoods we're talking about. And at the time, we wanted to limit it to Canada's 30 largest cities. The population has increased. So these were cities that at the time had more than 100,000 people. I think there are now 32 or 33 census metropolitan areas that actually have over 100,000. So we should be adding at least 3 more cities to the analysis if we're going to limit it to these CMAs that have more than 100,000 people. And we're actually undertaking work now with StatsCan to actually develop some kind of, with a proximity measures group, to look through a variety of different indicators so that we can expand the same kind of concept to many, many other smaller cities and towns in the country. And then, of course, we wanted to develop this index of environmental quality and calculate this score, this index score for each neighborhood. And I'll show you, when we're defining neighborhoods here, there's no great definition for that, but we wanted to at least link it to Stats Canada geography, and the dissemination area is the smallest level of geography which census data is released. It's about 300 to 700 people, so that's the area we're using. And then we wanted to explore the relationship among some of the indicators that we included in the index and see how this varies with population size. And then I was going to talk a little bit about some work that I'm just in the process of writing up, which is looking at how these index values cluster within cities and explore their association with the concept of marginalization. So when we were working through this process, we decided to sort of create these broader domains, and we drew from existing research that had been looking into the development of composite measures for environmental quality. So this included characteristics about the air, natural environments, green and blue spaces, specific characteristics about built environments, like concentration of intersections and roadways, sidewalks, those kinds of things. Noise levels within cities, water quality, radiation, climate, and weather. So those are sort of some broad categories that have been used. We call them sort of indicator domains in several other studies. And then we undertook a sort of systematic search of the literature within each of these domains and tried to find data sets that would relate to each of those domains. So we extracted a lot of metadata from different data sets. We looked at their spatial coverage, their temporal coverage. We wanted to make sure that they were urban, and that actually reduced the number of data sets considerably, because a lot of these sort of data on water quality and other domains, for example, are mostly available outside of urban areas. And then we also wanted to see what the methods look like that were used to capture these data and store these data, whether they or not they were available for the kind of research that we were interested in. once we had come up with our list, we decided to share that list with, you know, with what we're calling experts in the area, but we sent out our list to about 100, almost 150 people at various universities and federal, provincial departments across the country who had portfolios or research programs around environmental health or study exposure assessment. And we received about 18% of them responded with ideas about whether or not certain data sets would work or not, and also provided some insights into potentially other data sets that we could use, or ones that we had missed, which is extremely helpful. And we wanted to also find data sets that we could center around a census year. So we had some idea of some accuracy in terms of the population that we were dealing with as well. And at the time we were doing this, the 2021 census data wasn't released yet. So we went back to 2016. So we really wanted to sort of center our data around the 2016 period, sort of, you know, a 5-year window from 2014 to 2018, particularly if we started wanting to sort of line up temporally with health, you know, data sets about health behaviors and health outcomes. So the final indicator set included 3 measures of air quality. The first one being fine particles. Those are particles in the air with an air diameter of 2.5 microns or less. And I think most of you probably, I'm not in the room or online, are quite aware of the health effects of exposure to PM 2.5. Nitrogen dioxide. So both, you know, these are emissions. There's a variety of different sources, but combustion sources, and then distance to fossil fuel burning power plants as well. And so there's a variety of references there related to that. We included natural environments. So we looked at NDVI, sort of measure of chlorophyll production and vegetation. So it gives us an idea of how green things are, and also distance to water bodies. And that was sort of based off some work we've done with Dan Krause, linking, you know, distance to water bodies and risk of mortality in Canada. Excuse me. For the built environments, we just included road length, and there's a few reasons for that, and it was a tough one to really think about which one to include. But I really wanted to get an idea of, you know, we don't have noise data for all the cities we were looking at. In fact, at the time, there were only data for 5 cities. There are many more now, but so we wanted to get an idea of road length in relation to sort of an average noise level. But I realized too, it's also related to air pollution. Radiation, so we wanted to look at UV radiation exposure, and that's a data set you can get through Canoe as well. And then we wanted to look at temperature extremes. We wanted to see which parts of the cities are more or less likely to have higher or cooler temperatures. And so we wanted to see what would the temperature differences look like within specific neighborhoods during heat and cold events. So are certain neighborhoods much hotter during heat events or much cooler during cold events? And so obviously people living in those areas would be more likely to experience negative health outcomes from that. So we, you know, I won't go into details about processing all the data because that would be really boring, and a lot of that's in the article. But we calculated the decile rankings based on the distributions of all of these indicators, and of course hypothesized the relationship between these indicators and health. That's ultimately our interest, is seeing how these environmental exposures or environmental qualities related to health inequalities. And so, of course, air quality, we assume there's you know, the higher the value, the worse it is for your health. So it's an inverse relationship, whereas the more green you have, the better health you have. So it's correlated positively. And then we ranked for each indicator. They were summed up for all of the areas within each city and multiplied by 1.1, just so we could have a scale between 0 and 100, because we only have 9 indicators. So we felt like 0 to 100 made a lot more sense than 0 to 90. And all of these indicators were given equal weight, which is important to remember, which is very different than other composite measures. So we didn't, you know, try to apply some principal components analysis or anything like that. We're just leaving them as they are, the distributions as they are, And when we share the data, people can play around with different weightings or what have you, depending on the health outcomes of interest. And all of the Can-EQI values are calculated for the dissemination area level. So these are the different cities across the country, and includes about, well, not about, at the time it was 19,406,925 people, or about 55% of the Canadian population lives in these 30 cities. And in terms of the number of dissemination areas, that's about 28,026 dissemination areas, or almost 50% of all the dissemination areas of the country. Okay, what are the scores then? Get to the point. So this is sort of a breakdown here of the cities ranked according to population. When we first published this figure, I thought to myself, oh, that makes sense. We'll do it by population. And it never occurred to me that when the news outlets got a hold of this figure, that they wanted to figure out, well, who has the lowest environmental quality and who has the highest environmental quality. And you can see that within cities, if you look at these box plots, you can see there's quite a spread, particularly for larger cities. Although you do see certain trends as you move down the list. So I can't remember. I thought I had another slide in here for. I might have missed. Maybe it's coming up anyway. So the larger cities, as I mentioned, are on the top. The Can-EQI score is along the x-axis there, and the individual points there would be certain DAs within each city, for example, that have higher or lower scores that are beyond the interquartile range there. You can find this figure in the manuscript, in the article as well. And then we also looked at whether or not, how correlated are some of these indicators that we're including in the index. And most of them, some of them were moderately positively correlated, like population density, 2, for example. But on the whole, there's sort of weak positive relationships or weak negative relationships. But we do see that one thing that we do see is that the NDVI is quite strongly and positively correlated with the index itself. So that's something we might want to look at a little bit more. But in general, we're pretty pleased with how that worked out. Okay, I'm getting to the poll here now. So I'm gonna talk specifically about Vancouver in a minute, because I thought we should really start zooming in on Vancouver. So what DA or dissemination or neighborhood has the lowest EQI score in Vancouver? So the first one is the lowest. Okay, excellent. So the majority, well, almost majority, but those who answered Sullivan Heights were correct in saying that it would have the lowest Can-EQI score. And I'll point that out in a map in a second. And then can we move on to the next one? So which area has the highest score, do you think? And I should put a caveat on this, and I guess you can't take back your answer, but keep in mind that some dissemination areas may not have been included if no one lives there. Okay, didn't change much. So I'm going to show you the Thompson area, and I'm not sure if that's what you call it, but the Thompson neighborhood south of the airport. Anyway, so we'll look at that in a second. So this is a map of the Can-EQI values for Vancouver. Sorry I can't be there in person to chat about this. I think you know, a lot of good conversations come out of staring at maps. And of course, the first thing people tend to do is try and figure out where their house is on the map relative to everything else. But just in terms, now I'm hoping if I just hit this here, you see a little red circle come up there. That's Sullivan Heights. I think it's just south of Burnaby, the mountain there. And I apologize if I haven't lived in Vancouver for a long time, since I did my first year at UBC back in a while ago. So I know the city has changed quite a bit since that point, but that would be an area. So in Vancouver, as a total at this time, there was about 1.96 million people. Maybe you're over 2 million now. It encompasses about 22,746 dissemination areas, and the EQI in this area is about 24.4. The mean for the city is 50.4, which is nice, between 0 and 100. And the max area, the max EQI is in the Thompson area or Terranova Parks area, which has a EQI and a Can-EQI of 83.3. So we have these maps laid out for every city across the country in the supplemental files. So if you're interested in what other cities look like, you can look at those too, if you like. Okay, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about, okay, what do we do with this Can-EQI now? And one of the first things we thought we should start looking at is, well, how does this relate to socioeconomic conditions or socioeconomic inequalities? And do we find they're linked to, you know, our environmental differences? Is the difference in the quality of the environment also linked to socioeconomic circumstances in different cities? And so we used the Canadian Marginalization Index to look at this, and we just did it for 3 cities. And the reason why we only looked at 3 cities, you know, sort of in our first run, is because you have to remember that the EQI values that I was sharing with you previously and their distribution. So for example, in Vancouver, those EQI values, they're relative to all other EQI values in Canada, or for all the other 30 cities or 29 cities. So when we calculate the index, we're actually using the distribution of values from the different indicators for all 28,000 dissemination areas. And then the score is, you know, applied. So you can say that this dissemination area, the value of the Can-EQI in that dissemination area neighborhood, that's its relative value to every other neighborhood, all the other 28,000 dissemination areas in the country. So what we needed to do is we need to go back into the data and recalculate Can-EQIs that are specific to the city, right? So we wanted to make sure that the values were relative to the distribution of the indicators, the indicator values for that specific city only. And that... Oh, sorry. Did you guys lose me there for a second?
Yeah, you're good now. We lost you a little bit.
Yeah, sorry about that. So what we're looking at here is we want to see, well, how does you know, those who are least marginalized, you know, when you look at the marginalization data, it breaks it down into quintiles from least to most marginalized. And then do we see a corresponding pattern with the Can-EQI data? And you can see quite clearly that, yes, that is true, particularly for Montreal, which had probably the most difference. All of these were statistically significant in terms of their relationship. Vancouver sort of has a really interesting, you know, linear pattern there between sort of the least and most marginalized, and then Toronto a little bit less so, but there's still a pattern there as well. So the most marginalized for Vancouver, for example, for the environmental quality index, the most marginalized population scoring, they were about 14.63 EQI points, if you will, lower than the least marginalized, right? So that's the difference in environmental quality between the most and least marginalized in Vancouver, for example. And then the other thing we want to look at is whether or not the Can-EQI values were clustered in each of these cities as well. So we want to see if there were cold and hot spots, for example. So what's the sort of spatial correlation of Can-EQIs around the cities. And you can see that, that obviously there are areas that have much lower values. And those are the values that are in red, and they cluster together. If they're in red on the map, then they're significantly clustered. And there are higher EQI values that are in green. And if they're green on the map there, you can see that they are significantly, there's a significant spatial correlation between these neighborhoods across all three cities, but particularly in Montreal, you really see that difference. So then what we did was we looked at the marginalization values just for these cold and hotspot values, so you could really see the difference. And so where we have these, even amongst the areas where the I'll stop saying Canadian, the environmental quality index was clustered in these different areas, you still see a gradation across marginalization quintiles within each of these clusters as well. So even small changes at lower amounts of EQI or higher EQI across the marginalization categories, you'll still see this sort of difference, these change from higher EQI to lower EQI, even for areas that have high EQI values or low EQI values. And so for Vancouver specifically, had the largest difference in environmental quality between hot and cold spots, where the hot spots were 23.1 points higher than the cold spots, for example. Okay, so just summing up here, the Canadian Environmental Quality Index is, as I mentioned, it's really just a starting point for us to help identify inequalities in environmental conditions in our urban areas across the country. Hopefully through this talk today and an introduction to the index, I'm hoping that there are those of you with a critical perspective can probably see many of the flaws that I see in such an exercise. But as I mentioned, this is sort of the first iteration, and I think there's a lot of improvements. But I think being able to calculate a single value for what the environmental conditions are like in different areas really helps us to identify quickly and spatially what's going on in our cities and where to focus our efforts in terms of resources, investments, modifications of policies, and so on to improve health. So one of the areas we're looking at is, maybe do we weight the indicators differently, and do we weight, how would you go about weighting them? So, one example is like the Air Quality and Health Index, which includes, several different air quality parameters, and they have been weighted in the index according to the level of risk they have in terms of health outcomes, right? So, PM 2.5 might be weighted more heavily than ozone and so on. In this case, we have a broad number of indicators across different domains or different categories. So one could feasibly go through the literature and say, well, for example, how is length of roads, related to noise, or how is length of roads been used as an example to understand differences in health in urban areas, and what is the effect that it has on those differences. Or maybe it's something to do with air quality or greenness, what have you. So you could weight them, and that would change the values of the index, of course. The other thing to keep in mind is we had no indicator for water quality. And in urban areas, many urban areas, of course, water is sort of centrally provided. Here in Halifax, for example, we derive a lot of our water from lakes, surrounding lakes, and it's treated. And then it's, treated before we drink it, and then treated after it's gone to waste. I don't know if Victoria is there yet. I'm assuming Victoria and Halifax were sort of like larger cities that were laggards in terms of water treatment, but we don't really have there's no good database about water quality, although one could feasibly use some other metric, like if we had like a national database of water related pathogens and so on, that might be useful, but as far as I know, that doesn't exist. We've calculated all the values across these 30 cities, as I mentioned, and for these 28,000 dissemination areas, they are all related. they were they are the values in comparison to all the other cities in Canada, versus it was what I showed you, the city specific comparisons, where we only have that for Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. Obviously, it would be nice to finish that work and do the city only, calculate for city only EQIs for the rest of the cities. And then the other thing to consider too is, and this came up a number of times when doing interviews with media, and then also I had a couple of meetings with different different people who representatives from different cities across the country who want to know more, dig in a little bit more into the score and figure out, well, what do the indicators look like, and what's contributing to this score or that score, and so on. And as an example of how things don't always work out is looking at NDVI as a great example. And you have to go back to that first notion that I presented, that all cities sit within sort of an ecological context. And this is particularly true for places like Kelowna, for example. And if many of you have probably been to Kelowna, or maybe even you live there now, or places like Lethbridge, for example, the ecological conditions or the ecozone is quite different, for example, than it would be in Victoria. And so there's, even though there's a lot of nature and park space and so on, it may not always be green. And so it may have a much lower NDVI value, but it's not because there isn't a lot of nature. It's just because of the type of vegetation that's there. It's arid and so on. So, you're trying to apply one indicator to all locations across the country. And obviously we could be a little more sensitive to the sort of ecological differences within which cities operate. For future research, again, our goal is to finish this manuscript looking at sort of environmental differences across neighborhoods and social inequalities, as I've just sort of revealed some of the sort of figures that we're playing around with. And ultimately too, like to link these data to cohort data. So I've been exploring linkages with Can-EQI and CLSA and some other cohorts, just to see, because we can also break down the index, but just to see how the index as a whole relates to mortality or cardiovascular mortality or cancer mortality. And then, of course, we'd like to update the index at some point based on more recent environmental data and situated around the 2021 census, so 2019 to 2023 at some point. And ideally, too, we could take this online in the form of sort of an online atlas of some kind, so that people across the country would be able to sort of peruse and work through online maps and figure out what's going on in their neighborhood in terms of some of these environmental indicators that we're looking at. So there's some sort of future next steps for the project. And of course, I'd be really open to hearing your perspectives and opinions, and if there's interest as well in collaborating or using the data for your own work, I'd be interested in chatting about that as well. So that pretty much wraps it up. I want to thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you today, for the invitation. I really appreciate that. And if you're interested in chatting, there's a sort of a very simple website you can go to see what I get up to. And of course, I just want to thank funders, CHR, who funds quite a bit of the research that I do, and also Public Health Agency of Canada as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan.